All right, in this very short lecture, what we're going to do is start tying in the connection between myth or literature and the archaeology of the early Roman. And in this slide, what we're going to do is talk a little bit about what archaeology is showing us in Rome in the 500s. And we've already talked about the fact that the Romans cordoned off a bit of their area called the Pomerium. And I had mentioned before that this is a place where no armed troops could enter and so on. It was considered fairly sacred. And that continued for centuries past this particular period. We do know, if you look at the archaeological record in this area, that there's certainly evidence of fire. We talked about the fact that especially in what will become the Roman Forum, there's certainly lots of flooding from water coming off the hills, and of course the flooding of the Tiber, which did quite a bit of damage to the Forum and the buildings that were there. So what happens is, and this is probably luckily for us, the buildings collapse or they're destroyed, they just push them over and then build up on top of all of that. However, there's one thing to be aware of, is that you've got these massive temples being built in the 500s. So I've given you a few names here: Temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, fairly large temple. I've given you the sizes here: 183 feet by 165 feet. And the podium is the outside of the actual temple itself. We know that there's a temple to the goddess Diane and the temple to Castor and Pollux. These are fairly large buildings. And again, when you think of archaeology, don't just think about the building itself. Think about the process that was put in to building these things. So imagine the workforce you need to build a temple that's 183 feet by 165 feet. It's also talking about organization of the state, organization of the government. It's talking about the economy, and so on. And there's also evidence in the 500s of houses being built, especially on the side of Palatine Hill. And this will remain the case for a very long time. If you move fast forward to the 1st century BC, you've got Cicero, the very famous orator and senator, living in one of these houses that could possibly have been built 400 years previous to him. I mentioned this before, but it's a good thing to remember. You do have some Etruscan influences still. So in terms of the shape of the temple, and really we're talking about architecture here. Religious ideas, we talked about the fact that the Greeks brought their religion to Italy, and then the Etruscans borrowed some of their religion, and then the Romans borrowed some more. And divination, which is sort of the forecasting of the future. It's thought that the Romans probably picked up some of this. Now, does this indicate Etruscan kings? Probably not. Some of these kings certainly had Etruscan names, like Tarquinius Superbius, supposedly the last king of the Romans. More than likely, his family came from the Etruscan areas, and then he was technically a Roman. But it's really hard to tell. But as we've talked about, the Etruscans are just north of where the Roman settlement is, or where the Roman city will be. And so there's bound to be some type of influences, but it doesn't necessarily have to mean that they had Etruscan kings. Okay, so here are the big questions. Now that we've looked at what the literature is telling us, and most of this was written in the 1st century BC, about what was happening in the 700s, 600s, 500s BC, and what the archaeology tells us. So what is true and what is not true? Well, those are pretty important questions to ask, and I have to admit, I don't know if we actually know what the answers are. So archaeology can tell us a little bit about, buildings and structures, and then we have to make guesses about social structure after that. But what we've been finding is that the myths or the literature that were written centuries later seem to carry bits of truth in them. And then you have to ask, does it really matter both to us as modern people and to the later Romans? And I think the answer is yes to both of these. So it does matter to us. A lot of our civilization, Western civilization, is sort of built on top of what the Greeks did, what the Romans did, and so on. And does it matter that the literature matches up with the archaeology, at least in some cases? I think it does because it makes a stronger case for both of them. And it looks like right now we are dependent on both what the literature tells us about what happened and archaeology. And whenever we can make the link between the two, that just makes it all that much stronger. It's extremely important to the later Romans, and this second question is definitely tied to the third one. What do the stories mean to later Romans? We looked at this a little bit last week in terms of what do these things mean. So you've got all these stories about Romulus and Remus and the killing of one brother and how that killing led to the founding of the city and his sort of leadership. And of course later Romans believed that that type of story was the foundation of their civilization, and they were meant to sort of live like that. You've got the story of the rape of the Sabine women and the rape of Lucretia. What is that telling Roman women? Well, in effect, what it's doing, and it did this for centuries, is it told them how to behave. So Roman women, especially like Lucretia, she was considered to be the best wife. She was at home spinning her wool, taking care of the servants, taking care of the household. That was considered to be the best behavior for a wife. And we find that later on Roman women were definitely affected by this particular story. So these stories mean quite a bit to the foundation of the Roman state. And of course they mean quite a bit to us because it's helpful to have these literary stories and try and see where they actually fit into the actual history of what had happened.